On the morning of the 5th of June, 1967, 15 ships entered the Suez Canal on an ordinary transit. They came out in 1975. By then, only 2 of them could still move under their own power. Most people know the Suez Canal as the waterway that got blocked for 6 days in 2021. That one was on every front page in the world. The 8-year closure is mostly forgotten, and it's the one that rearranged global trade. So what actually happens when the world's most important waterway closes and stays closed for 8 years? Some of it can be measured precisely. The closure is one of the only times in history when distance changed and nothing else did. So economists still use those 8 years as an experiment. They found that the cost of it didn't land where almost everyone assumes. It starts with a convoy on a Monday morning carrying 5 tons of kitchen clocks. On the morning of Monday, the 5th of June, 1967, a German cargo ship entered the Suez Canal at Suez with the Morning Convoy. She was called the Münsterland. She belonged to the Hamburg-America line. She measured 9,365 gross tons, and her master was Captain Karl Hoffmann. It was her 18th voyage from Australia to Europe. Ships went through the canal in convoys, and this was the morning one. She was fully laden. In her holds were 3,000 tons of steel and steel wire and nearly 2,000 tons of wool. There was over 1,000 tons of a special sand used for making sandpaper. There were tinned fruit, hides and skins, and agricultural machinery. In the refrigerated space, there were 300 tons of pears and 57 tons of eggs, and there were 5 tons of kitchen clocks. She never delivered any of it. War broke out in the Middle East that same day. It caught several ships by surprise while they were still on passage, and the Münsterland stopped where she was. The widest part of the Suez Canal is a lake, the Great Bitter Lake, and that's where the convoy came to rest. Egypt closed the canal within a day. Closing it meant sinking things in the channel. Ships went down, and so did dredgers, other floating craft, and a bridge. 15 ships were already inside. The 15 flew the flags of 8 countries: West Germany, Sweden, France, Britain, and the United States, and from the other side of the Cold War, Poland, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. The British had the largest group, with 4. The others included the Swedish Kilara, the French Essayons, the Polish Boleslaw Bierut, the Bulgarian Vasil Levski, and the Czechoslovak Lednitz. Most accounts of what happened next say 14. 14 is the number that ended up anchored together in the Great Bitter Lake. The 15th was an American ship called the Observer. The wrecks Egypt had sunk cut her off from the others, and she rode out the closure on her own in a different lake further north called Lake Timsa. The year before, about 21,000 ships had gone through the canal. That's an average of 58 a day every day. It was the shortest sea route between Europe and Asia, and within 2 days it stopped carrying anything at all. Most of what it carried was oil, and 1966 was the last full year it carried any. That year, the canal moved 168 million tons of oil northbound. Half a century earlier, the figure had been under 300,000 tons. Europe had built its energy supply around the shortcut. 60% of Italy's oil came through it, 39% of France's, and a quarter of Britain's. The canal ran on a convoy system, 1 northbound and 2 southbound each day. By 1967, a single transit took about 15 hours, and it was getting slower because the ships using it were getting bigger. The Münsterland entered the canal on a Monday morning near the end of a voyage from Australia. She came out of the Great Bitter Lake in May 1975. Waterways get blocked, and then they get cleared. The Suez Canal had been closed once already, and not long before. It shut in October 1956, during the crisis that followed Egypt's decision to take the canal from its French and British owners, and it opened again the following spring. That closure lasted about half a year. The president who took the canal was Gamal Abdel Nasser, and he was still president in 1967. So the question isn't why the canal closed. It's why it stayed closed for 8 years instead of half a year. The answer is that the canal stopped being a waterway and became a border. Israel took the Sinai Peninsula on the 7th and 8th of June 1967, and its army stopped at the canal. From that week onward, Israel held the East Bank and Egypt held the West, with the water in between. Egypt blocked both ends to keep Israel from using it. They stayed there, and they kept fighting. The 3 years that followed are called the War of Attrition, and they ran from 1967 to 1970. Nasser went out to the Suez front himself, with Egypt's senior commanders. The canal wasn't a shipping route anymore, it was the thing both armies were aiming across. Israel built a line of fortifications along its bank and called it the Bar-Lev Line. Once a country has built forts along a canal, it has stopped thinking of the canal as a canal. The fighting went on until August 1970, and then it stopped with a ceasefire. The ceasefire didn't move the border. Israel was still on one bank, and Egypt was still on the other, and the canal stayed shut, with the ships still in it. Another war finally moved it. In 1973, Egypt attacked across the canal and took back the East Bank. Israel kept the rest of the Sinai Peninsula, and at the ceasefire it still held a pocket on the western side. That was untangled by a disengagement agreement the following January, and only then did the canal stop being a front line. The water could finally be worked on rather than fought over for the first time since 1967. There was a great deal to work on. 8 years of war had left the channel full of mines and wreckage, and none of it could be touched while the shooting was going on. Clearing it took 3 separate operations, run by the United States with British and French help, and it took most of 1974. The Americans did the first sweep by helicopter. An assault ship, the Iwo Jima, anchored off the northern end of the canal, and helicopters flew off her towing magnetic sleds through the water. They started at the approaches to Port Said and worked their way down the canal over the next 6 weeks. Underwater, it was slower. American and Egyptian teams finished one full sweep of the canal bottom in late November 1974. British and French divers were searching too, and areas were swept twice and sometimes 3 times because every group kept finding things the group before had missed. The American divers weren't allowed to handle the ordnance themselves. They trained Egyptian Navy divers to do it and went out in the boats with them as advisors. The canal reopened in June 1975. President Anwar Sadat was there, with his government and a crowd of foreign dignitaries. The clearance work wasn't actually finished and carried on until the end of July, with ships already moving through. The canal reopened when it stopped being the front line. In October 1967, 4 months after they stopped, the officers and crews of all 14 ships in the Great Bitter Lake met aboard one of the British ships, the Melampus. They founded something and gave it a name. They called it the Great Bitter Lake Association, and its purpose was mutual support. In practice, that meant dividing the work up by ship. A British vessel called the Port Invercargill had the most deck space, so football was played on her. Church services were held on a West German ship, the Nordwind. Films were shown on a Bulgarian freighter, the Vasil Levski. The Swedish Kalara had a swimming pool, so the Kalara was where you went to swim. They ran lifeboat races between the ships. They founded a yachting club. The 14 ships flew 8 flags. Poland, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia were on one side of the Cold War. Britain, the United States, and West Germany were on the other. In the Great Bitter Lake, the Bulgarians ran the cinema, the West Germans ran the church, and the British ran the football. None of this was happening in a quiet place. The 2 armies were still dug in on either bank, and raiding parties from both sides slipped across the canal to gather intelligence. The football matches and the film nights were going on inside a live front line. Sunday was the fixed point of the week. The bells of 5 ships were rung, and the crews came across the water dressed in their Sunday best. Church was also the post office and the parish notice board. Letters were stamped, announcements were made, meetings were fixed for the week ahead, and everybody caught up on the gossip. In 1968, they held their own games. The idea came from the Poles. The stamps are the part that lasted. The crews made their own by hand because they had a post office, and a post office needs stamps. Collectors around the world began buying them. Then the Egyptian Postal Authority recognized them, which meant a letter carrying a handmade stamp from a stranded ship could be posted anywhere in the world and it would arrive. The ships were changing color the whole time. Desert sand blew across the lake and settled on them year after year until the hulls and decks had gone the color of the shore. That's where the name comes from. People started calling them the Yellow Fleet. The canal, meanwhile, was doing something nobody expected. The main worry had been silt. A canal that isn't dredged is supposed to fill in, and nobody was dredging. It didn't happen. About 90% of the silt in the Suez Canal had always been stirred up by the propellers of ships going through it, and no ships were going through it. The water sat still, and the canal stayed clear on its own. The crews got smaller, there was no reason to keep full complements aboard ships that weren't going anywhere, so the numbers came down. In 1969, the ships were gathered into groups, which cut the number of men needed to look after them. The ones who stayed were rotated home every 3 months. In 1972, the last of the German crews were sent home. Looking after the ships was handed to a Norwegian company. The association had been founded in a single meeting by every crew at once. It ended a few men at a time over 3 years as they were rotated off. The ships stayed where they were in the same lake, minded by a company none of the crews had ever worked for. There was another way to get oil from the Gulf to Europe, and everybody knew what it was. You go the long way, around the bottom of Africa and past the Cape of Good Hope. The Suez Canal was the shortest sea route between Asia and Europe. It had never been the only one. The long way is a great deal longer, and that changes the sums on a voyage. A longer trip costs more in fuel and takes more days, and you claw that back by carrying more oil each time you go, which means bigger ships. Now, this is the part that usually gets told wrong. It's often said that the 8-year closure is why supertankers exist. It isn't. The change had started more than a decade earlier, and it started with the other closure. Until 1956, tankers were designed to be able to navigate the Suez Canal. The canal set the maximum size, so that was the size ships were built to. Then the canal shut during the Suez Crisis. Oil went around the Cape instead, and ship owners worked out that a bigger tanker moved the same oil for less. After 1956, the canal stopped being the thing that decided how big a ship could be. The ships grew for the next 10 years. In 1959, a tanker called the Universe Apollo broke 100,000 tons dead weight, the first one that ever had. In 1962, an American-built ship called the Manhattan came in at 106,000. And in 1966, the Idemitsu Maru was launched at 206,000 long tons, the first very large crude carrier ever built. That was a year before the Six-Day War. So the trend was already running. The 8 years took the brakes off completely. The fleet numbers show it. At the end of 1957, there was not a single tanker in the world over 100,000 tons. At the end of 1967, the year the canal closed, there were 66. 59 of those were between 100 and 150,000 tons. 5 were bigger again. 2 were over 200,000. 1 year later, at the end of 1968, the number over 200,000 tons had gone from 2 to 17. That same year, the first ultra-large crude carrier was built, a ship called the Universe Ireland. By the end of 1976, there were 676 tankers over 200,000 tons, and they kept getting bigger. The Globtic Tokyo had her keel laid in 1972, while the canal was shut, and she came in at 483,000 tons dead weight. The Bacillus class followed later in the decade at 553,000 tons each. Here's what matters about those numbers. There's a limit on how big a ship the canal can take with a full cargo in it, and the industry has a name for it: Suezmax. Today that sits somewhere between 120 and 200,000 tons dead weight, and in the 1970s it was a good deal less. Every one of those ULCCs was built too big to carry a full load through the canal. To use it at all, one had to go through empty or pump part of its oil out first and pick it up on the other side. So the closure didn't invent the supertanker. It did something more permanent than that. For 8 years, the canal wasn't a constraint on anybody's drawing board, and by the time it opened again, the largest ships afloat had been designed as though it didn't exist. This story is almost always told as a Middle East story. The war, the oil, the tankers going around Africa, Europe worrying about its refineries, all of that is true, and none of it is where the cost landed. The closure can be measured, and almost nothing in economic history can be. To know what distance does to trade, you'd need a world where distance changed and nothing else did. That's not something anybody can arrange. But in June 1967, it happened by accident, and then in June 1975, it happened again in reverse. An economist at Dartmouth College, James Firer, used exactly that. He published the study through the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it later ran in the Journal of Development Economics. It treats the 8 years as a natural experiment, which is what they are. The first finding is the one that reframes everything. For most of the world, the canal closing did not change how far anything had to travel. The typical pair of countries saw no change in sea distance at all. If you were trading across the Atlantic or within Europe or across the Pacific, the canal shutting was news and nothing more. For a small number of countries, it changed a great deal. Pakistan and India saw the average distance to their trading partners rise by about 30%. Many East Asian countries took a shock in the range of 10%. And the very largest shocks all landed in the same place. Every trading pair with an extreme increase in distance included one of these countries: Djibouti, Pakistan, India, Kenya, Somalia, Tanzania, or Sri Lanka. All of them sit on the Arabian seaside of the canal. Their trade fell. Farer's graphs show a clear drop for every group that took a distance shock of 10% or more. The worse the shock, the worse the fall. When the canal reopened in 1975, the pattern ran the other way. It didn't happen quickly either. The effect took several years to work through, which is part of why it was easy to miss at the time. Trade routes don't snap. They get slowly re-optimized around whatever the new distances are, and then they stay there. Then Farer takes the second step, which is the one that matters. The closure had nothing to do with these countries' own economies. So if their trade moved and their incomes moved with it, the trade is what did it. He finds their incomes did move at an elasticity of roughly a quarter. In plainer terms, when one of these countries lost 10% of its trade, it lost about 2.5% of its income. Farer leaves the combatants and their neighbors out of the regressions altogether. Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Sudan, Libya, Lebanon, and Turkey are all excluded, because for them, the war was not just a change in distance. He also drops the oil exporters, whose trade and income moved together almost mechanically. So these figures describe the countries that had nothing to do with the fighting and nothing to sell out of the ground. That's the answer to what happens when the world's most important waterway closes for 8 years. It isn't mainly about oil, and it wasn't mainly paid in Europe. The canal closed in Egypt, and the bill arrived in Karachi, in Mombasa, and in Colombo. The canal reopened in the summer of 1975, and 2 years after that, Egypt finished building a pipeline that runs alongside it. It follows the same ground and joins the same two seas. It's called the SUMED, which is short for Suez Mediterranean. It starts at a terminal called Ain Sokhna on the Gulf of Suez at the top of the Red Sea. It ends at Sidi Karir on the Mediterranean coast, just west of Alexandria. That's about 200 miles. The canal is 120. The pipeline runs further because it comes out at Alexandria instead of Port Said, but it joins the same two seas. It's built as two parallel lines, each 42 inches across. The two lines together can move about 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. It was commissioned in 1977, 2 years after the ships came out of the Great Bitter Lake. The reason it exists isn't complicated, and Egypt has never pretended otherwise. For 8 years, Egypt owned a canal that earned it nothing, because nothing went through it to pay a toll. And over those same 8 years, the rest of the world had quietly found out it could manage without the canal. So Egypt built a second way to move oil from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, one that doesn't float. If the canal ever shut again, the oil would still cross Egypt, and Egypt would still be paid for it. It would just cross underground instead of on the water. Egypt's state petroleum company holds half of the SUMED, and the other half belongs to the countries whose oil goes through it. Saudi Aramco has a stake, and so does a company from Abu Dhabi, 3 Kuwaiti companies, and Qatar's national oil company. So the Gulf producers put up half the money for a bypass around a waterway they can't do without. Egypt let them and kept the other half. Everybody at that table had spent the previous decade learning the same lesson. The pipeline has never been busy, and it was never really meant to be. In 2009, more than 30 years after it opened, it was moving about 1.1 million barrels a day. Its capacity is 2.5 million. It runs at well under half of what it could do because the canal is open and the canal is cheaper. That's what insurance looks like when a country buys it. You build the second route, you keep it staffed and full of oil, and then you hope it stays half empty. There's a proposal to extend it further across the Red Sea to the Saudi coast. It would then run on to the end of Saudi Arabia's own east-west pipeline at Yanbu. The hedging didn't stop in 1977. Nobody who lived through the 8 years wanted to depend on one line on a map again. In May 1975, 2 ships raised anchor in the Great Bitter Lake and left it for the first time in 8 years. They were the Münsterland and the Nordwind, both German, and they went north. They were the only 2 that could. 14 ships had gone into the lake in 1967. One of them, an American ship called the African Glen, was sunk there in 1973 when the next war came over the top of them. Of the 13 that were left, 11 could no longer move. They were towed out, and most were sold and broken up within a few years. 8 years is a long time in shipping. The world had gone over to containers while they sat there, and a general cargo ship built in the 50s had nothing much left to do. And there was still the 15th ship. The Observer had spent the whole closure by herself in Lake Timsa, cut off from the others in the first week by the wrecks Egypt had sunk. She never joined the association, never played in the football matches, and never went to the Sunday services. The same record that loses track of the 12 loses track of her as well. The Münsterland and the Nordwind reached Hamburg on the 24th of May, 1975. More than 30,000 people came down to the port to watch them come in. For the Münsterland, that was the end of a round voyage to Australia and back that had lasted 8 years, 3 months, and 5 days. She had left with a full hold, and everything in it had been loaded for a trip of a few weeks. The canal itself reopened on the 5th of June, 1975. President Anwar Sadat came with his government and a crowd of foreign dignitaries, and the first convoy since 1967 went through. 8 years earlier, almost to the day, the last one had gone in and stopped. So the question is whether it all came back, and the honest answer is that the canal did and the world didn't. The traffic recovered, ships came back through, and they have been coming through ever since. But they never came back in the same numbers. In 1966, the canal was handling 58 transits a day. By the middle of the 1980s, it was handling about 50, and yet it was carrying much more. The net tonnage through the canal in 1966 was around 278 million tons. By the mid-80s, that had risen to about 355 million. Fewer ships, more cargo. That's the 8 years, written into the canal's own numbers. The fleet that came back was a fleet of much larger vessels, built during the closure for a world that went round Africa. The canal was now taking whichever of them would fit. It stayed that way for a long time. In 2018, more than half a century on, the canal handled 18,000 transits, still fewer than it handled in 1966. It moved about 4 times as much cargo doing it. The ship count didn't beat 1966 again until the 2020s, and by then, each ship was carrying a load nobody in 1967 had a berth for. The ships got home, or 2 of them did. The routes that came back were not the routes that left.